Welcome to the podcast about investing in startups, where existing investors can learn how to get the best deal possible, and those that have never before invested in startups can learn the keys to success from the venture experts. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is The Full Ratchet.
Welcome to another special release of Investor Stories. On this installment, the experts discuss a startup that they did not invest in, why they passed, and if there was a key learning that now informs their approach. Here is the segment called Why I Passed. On today's special segment, we have Rebecca Kaden of Union Square Ventures. Rebecca, this is the anti-portfolio question. Can you tell us about a good or bad pass, a story about a startup that you passed on?
Sure. Definitely. I mean, I obsess way more on the bad passes than I do on the good passes.
Don't we all?
And there have definitely been a bunch of those. But the one that comes to mind that I feel like I've learned the most from is Stitch Fix. Stitch Fix was one of the earliest companies I actually saw at Mavron. Katrina Lake, who's the CEO, was someone I knew. So I, had felt like, okay, I'm bringing this in. I know Katrina. She's so great. And, we passed, and I say we because I was associated at the time, so I beat myself up about it, but I probably also didn't have the authority to do anything. But I think the learning there, look, I actually think you can always justify your pass. I can tell you why we passed, and you'd be like, okay, sure, fine, right? The easiest thing to do in venture is to pass. But what we should have seen that should have made us do this was how good of a recruiter she was. And since then, I feel like I've learned through data often that I think the thing that most correlates with eventual success is, can the founder in early days convince people to join them before it's obvious, and convince a caliber of people to join them before it's obvious that really makes you pause and say, wow. And Katrina, even then, even when Stitch Fix was so early, even when it really wasn't obvious, had convinced phenomenal people to join her. The first being Mike Smith, who had ran Walmart.com, which is, an operations madhouse. And he was the star there, and he had joined her as COO. And that was only the first of many. Person who ran algorithms out of Netflix. We actually introduced her to someone who had run head of people ops for both Starbucks and Lululemon. At a dinner, literally a week later, she had convinced her to join. And those kind of data points are extremely significant in understanding an eventual success, because companies are built by founders, and founders who are forces of nature and are able to build the best teams are going to win. And that's what we should have seen there.
Awesome. On today's special segment, we have James Hardiman of Data Collective. James, whether it be a good or a bad pass, can you talk about a startup that you passed on and why it was that you passed?
Yeah, generally I'll talk about maybe one bias that we have. So I think there's some passes that we've made where the technical diligence hasn't come back very strong. And so because of that, we've kind of made the conclusion like, this really isn't in scope for us. The tech isn't deep enough, if you will. But those companies, maybe ultimately drive, to big outcomes. I think the lesson there is, maybe an obvious statement, you don't need the best tech to build, the best company necessarily. I think inferior tech with great execution, good sales and marketing and distribution, can certainly beat better tech.
Interesting.
And so I think that's important to appreciate. I think we've made the decision that we might miss those wins, but that's okay. It's important for us to consistently be investing in the best tech, and then try and drive those teams towards the best execution, the best sales, the best marketing, and the best distribution. But there's certainly been companies that I've passed on because at the time, maybe the tech didn't feel like it was that differentiated, but that have gone on to be very successful. I think the other bias that sometimes I've made is, not wanting to invest because I felt the price was too high. And this is one that I think I'm still struggling with as an investor. The one that comes to mind right now that's, already realized an exit, there was a company called Newtonomy that was working on self-driving cars. When I was talking to them several years ago, and this was before kind of the hype around this industry, before, the Cruise acquisition, $4 billion, they were looking to raise, a smallish round on, a well-priced note, I think $40 million cap or so. And I just couldn't kind of get conviction at that price point. I felt it was out of market. Now that company went on to sell. I actually forgot who acquired it, but for $450 million. And so in hindsight, that certainly would have been a good investment for us. And I think, the lesson that I learned here is, there's oftentimes it's hard to get a good deal on startups. And if you feel like you got a good deal, you probably didn't. And companies where I've invested because I felt the price was low, like, oh, this is a steal, tend not to always do that well. And so I think there's a lesson there to not be too price sensitive, because the best companies will hopefully live up to those valuations.
That's right. On today's special segment, we have Evangelos Simoudis of Synapse Partners. Evangelos, can you tell us about a good or a bad pass? A story about a startup that you chose not to invest in.
We chose not to invest in a mapping company and a perception company, and both of those I think we are going to prove to be bad decisions on us. But we continue to have very good interactions with their teams, and their valuations right now are prohibitive for us. But we think that in both cases they're creating. They will be important members of this new ecosystem.
Do you remember the reasons why you chose to pass, and has it kind of adjusted maybe your eval process?
The reasons that we in both cases was because of what we saw as as I said, we do a lot of scoring. And we had certain questions about the management team and how they were scored, we also had certain questions about the technology and as it turns out, in both cases they've made some key hires that have enabled them. Key hires, and they've struck a couple of partnerships with large corporations that enable them, at least what it appears for the time being, to have overcome at least what we had perceived as shortcomings. Got it.
And finally, Evangelos, what investor has inspired and influenced you most, and why? When I got into the venture industry, I consider myself very lucky to have been mentored by Alan Patrikoff, who was one of the founders of Apex Partners. And Alan actually taught me both how to look at deals and not get overly excited, even though I believe that sometimes I do get overly excited. But also how to persevere through thick and thin, if you will. I see, Alan obviously retired from Apex, and now he built yet another success with Greycroft Partners. Yeah. He's been able to attract some really talented people around him, and continues to build a great company. So to me, he's actually a great inspiration. And as I said, I consider myself lucky to have been mentored by him as I was making my first steps as a venture investor. Excellent. And then what's the best way for listeners to connect with you?
So I'm very good with email, and my email is simoudis@synapsepartner.co, not NM at the end. I also have my blog. It's corporateinnovation.co, and I get messages there. And finally, LinkedIn, I get quite a bit of traffic there, and I try to stay on top of it.
Great. Well, Evangelos, it was great to read the book, and even more of a pleasure to get a chance to connect with you here and get your thoughts on the program. Thanks so much for making the time, and look forward to connecting again soon.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
That will conclude this installment of Investor Stories. If you're enjoying the program and would like to see it continue, take a moment and leave a 5-star review in iTunes. Also, if you'd like updates on new content from TFR, as well as the top 10 VC articles every week, go to fullratchet.net and sign up for the newsletter. Okay, that will wrap things up for today. Until next time, over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks for joining me.